tune in and listen to your child. And if because a lot of these things come out as behavior issues, and that's the first thing like people jump to if they're not really thinking about, it's like, oh, he's misbehaving, we have to like take away his iPad or punish him or ground him or something to stop this behavior. But go deeper and just say, like, why are you, what's causing this behavior? Are there triggers? Are there things happening beforehand? Is it really loud in this room? Are there fluorescent lights? Is there like weird smells? Is it like check all the sensory stuff, because they could be reacting to some sensory input that you may not think is distracting, but for them is overwhelming, because that's very common with a lot of autistic people. And if you can kind of remove some of those distractions, or, some people need to move around more. Some people can listen without making eye contact. In fact, forcing someone to make eye contact is so distracting for them that they won't even hear you. So I think it's understanding those things about your child and then seeing what kind of accommodations work best for them.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello, fellow do-gooders and friends. I'm your host, Corinna Bellizzi. And today I have a couple of treats in store for you. For one, I want to share that this is going to air around the second official anniversary of this show being around. And so today I invited someone to talk with me who was just so gracious with her time before I even recorded my first episode. Podcasting is a journey. It takes an army of collaborators to help you get it into the world. And sometimes those collaborators just look like people that you've had the opportunity to connect with that are already in the game, that are cheering you on from the sidelines or helping share your podcast with the world. It doesn't have to mean you have a bunch of employees. You could be a fully solo operation like myself here. So I started this podcast 2 years ago, specifically because I wanted to bring more attention, shine more light on issues that I felt deserved more attention, to connect with thought leaders, to share their stories, some of whom might be kind of the unsung heroes that are in your lives. Many of the guests I've featured have come through networking with guests I featured. And in other cases, it's just individuals whose paths I crossed that are really working to put good work into the world. More recently, I've been tapped on the shoulder by press agencies wanting me to interview thought leaders that are out there doing some really big things, like the creation of monarch tractors. I've gone on location to press events. I've even been privy to some trail systems before they were even open to the public with the San Vicente, which apparently I always insist on pronouncing wrong. I believe it's San Vicente Redwood Forest in Santa Cruz County in California. So all of that being said, I've made a couple of decisions about where I'm heading with the podcast. And ultimately, I want to be more transparent, share a little bit more of my personal journey. Now, I've done this in phases along the way with the show, but I've always kept, let's say, some distance from certain topics that we cover. And I just don't think that that always makes for the most connected listening experience for all of you. Now, today's guest is someone you've heard from before. Her name is Carolyn Kiel. She has a podcast called Beyond 6 Seconds. After getting to meet her in person at She Podcast Live back in, I believe that was fall 2021, October 2021. It's already more than a year ago, which is hard to believe. I really felt like we connected even more deeply. I recognized in her a leader that I really respected, somebody who was willing to also take their podcast and make a pivot a bit to be more transparent about her own experience and ultimately dive deep into the world of neurodivergence. Now, this has come with some success for her in her podcast. She's been acknowledged by now multiple awards, from Signal Awards recently to, I want to get this right, the Positive Change Podcast Awards, and also W3 Awards. So her deep dives into various types of neurodivergence and her willingness to share honestly about her own diagnosis of autism have just made her, for me, someone that I want to continue to look up to continue to collaborate with. So without further ado, I'm going to bring her up and share some further news with her once we get this all kind of kicked off. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Corinna, it's good to see you, and thanks for having me on the show.
So yeah, the big news, 2 years in and just getting a little more comfortable sharing more of me. I think you can probably relate to that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
So the other reason I wanted to be sure I brought you on, you introduced me a while ago to Hunter Hansen, who
Oh,
is an autistic adult who was out there with his own YouTube channel, which seems to have since gone dark. I don't know if he's producing any content anymore, as well as a blogger. I mean, he really was just helping people understand what it might be like to be an autistic adult, because this seemed to be the thing that we stopped talking about. We talk about autism in kids, but in adults, it's like this silent struggle.
right.
So I wanted for you to have the opportunity to talk about your experience, since it's now been, I believe, over a year since you got the diagnosis. You've been out here podcasting specifically about neurodivergence from a variety of perspectives. What is this like, this new reality for you?
It's been a very interesting journey. So, I mean, I've been podcasting for 5 years. My show just passed its 5-year anniversary, and most of that time was just a general interview show. So, as you said, once I got my own diagnosis of being autistic, I really decided to refocus and interview other neurodivergent people. It was just in some ways, I just wanted to learn more. So I was excited to learn not just from autistic adults, but other adults with, dyslexia and ADHD and Tourette syndrome and all different types of neurodivergence. So it's just been an incredible learning experience for me, one that I don't think I would have really understood as much about all the different ways that humans think and process information and just live their lives, and how similar and different we all are. So it's been a really wonderful learning experience for me. And I've also really tried to challenge myself to share more about myself, whether it's about, you know, my late diagnosis of autism and what that feels like, that process and that journey, to just other thoughts I have about, things in the media or just other experiences I'm trying to process, because I find that other people relate to that as well. So that has been a challenge for me, because I'm much more comfortable interviewing other people than I am sort of spontaneously sharing about myself. But I feel like
Being in the hot seat
it's
today.
important to be able to share that. Yeah, it's important to be able to share that on the show. People really connect when the host shares more about themselves. So that's what it's been like.
So I wondered too, because you actually have interviewed somebody who is nonverbal.
Yes.
And I will admit, I didn't get a chance to listen to that show before this. I intended to. I saw the title. I was like, wait a minute. How do you interview a nonverbal person? Can you talk specifically about this episode?
Yes. So that was an interview I did last year, came out in April of last year. And there's a significant percentage of autistic people who are non-speaking. And we tend to say non-speaking because they definitely have like language capabilities. It's just the act and the motor act of speaking is something that is a challenge for them. And there's all different ranges of abilities there. And I knew I wanted to interview someone who was non-speaking, because there are several advocates out there who are sharing their own experiences, and they tend to be that population tends to not get to share a lot about themselves because of their communication disabilities. So I wound up connecting with Noah Seaback. He is a non-speaking autistic advocate. He's a writer. He has a small business where he mentors other non-speaking autistic people and their families. And every interview is a little different. That one took obviously a lot more preparation. So I always write out my questions in advance. And that's what I did for this interview. I shared them with Noah and his parents. His mother was what's called a CRP, his communication regulation partner. So basically, Noah spells out his answers on a letterboard, which is a visitor board with the alphabet letters on it. And then she either writes it down or she can remember and read it out. So, and then his father was there during the interview to just read the prepared answers. So it was kind of a group effort in terms of recording the actual episode. But Noah was especially gracious to me with his time, because he recognized that I had never really spoken with a non-speaking autistic person before. So we actually had a pre-meeting, and he sent me a lot of things to read to educate myself about, what non-speaking autism is and a lot of the issues and challenges that people face. And so he spent a lot of time educating me and helping me get prepared and feel comfortable. And I'm really grateful for that. And we had a great interview. So again, some of the questions were pre-written, some of his answers were pre-prepared, but I also asked him some spontaneous questions, which he spelled out during the conversation. And I love that interview because he's charming, he's witty, he has a lot to say. So it was very easy actually to communicate and have a conversation with him. So definitely that's one of my favorite episodes, and that's one of the episodes that was recognized with some of the awards that you mentioned up front. That one got a W3 and a Signal Award, so that one got called out specifically. So I'm proud of that one, and really appreciate Noah spending time with me.
Wow. Well, I will say I've had some experience with non-speaking individuals, and correcting my own language here from nonverbal to non-speaking, because this individual was actually using a computer to read letters with their eye. Like, they'd move their eye around
Mm.
on a screen, and then the computer would speak for them. And it was amazing to me how quickly they were able to converse this way. Um, I can move really quickly. So it was actually somewhat of a surprise. I wonder if that technology is something that's also being used in other non-speaking autistic individuals.
Yeah, I think I've read a recent study or just sort of evolutions around it, but there are different communication methods. Some of them are, it depends on the individual person's ability, depending on, because I've since recorded a few more interviews with non-speaking people. They're not out yet. They're coming out in March and April, but some will type on an iPad or have a special app on the iPad that lets them sort of type or text to type sort of technology. It really depends on the person and their specific disabilities and their specific
Mhm.
abilities in terms of what communication method works for them.
Well, eventually we'll get to a space where we have a neural link and they're just able to think it and it comes
Right.
out. So I'm sure that's on the horizon, whether or not we think it's here in the next 5 years or 50.
Yeah,
That's a relatively short time in the grand scheme of things.
exactly.
Now, there's another bit, I'm reflecting a lot on past episodes. Every time I come up to an anniversary or some waypoint, like the 100th episode, I think back about all of the earlier content. And I've been pausing on the Hunter Hansen content a bit because somebody actually reached out to me and asked me if I knew how to get in touch with him because he'd apparently come off social media.
Mhm.
Now, I can imagine there's a variety of reasons someone might choose to do that. They might simply say, I'm in a different stage in my life. I don't want everything in my life to be public anymore. Or you might run into some legal reasons you needed to do that. There's all sorts of craziness. But
Right.
I also had been thinking a lot about whether I am personally on the spectrum. And I took a bunch of online tests. And every time I do, I show up as being autistic.
Mhm.
So, um, people who I talk to that are close to me, they, go, yes, I'm gonna joke about me, 1, 2, 3, 4, bang, bang, bang from The Simpsons, something like that. Or having some what others would call OCD tendencies of just needing things a certain way and whatnot. But the reason I chose to do that too was because I was confronting some behavior issues in my younger child that I identified as likely being autistic.
Mhm.
And he was just diagnosed officially on Monday this week
Wow.
as autistic.
Mhm.
So this gives us new tools, new support systems, and at least now we know, right?
Oh, yeah.
But going through a 4-hour in-person psychiatric review where they are asking you all sorts of questions while also observing the behavior of a child and running them through certain tests only revealed further the same thing that I've suspected. And whether I choose to go through a formal diagnosis at any point is kind of, I don't know if it matters,
Yeah.
right? But at this point, I feel like I know it and I'm going to own it. And we'll see if that reveals, new ways that I can perhaps support my child with this kind of unique understanding, reflecting back on moments in my life where I really struggled in
Mm.
school, probably through fourth grade. And then even through probably my early teens, just because I was obviously different.
Mhm.
And all of the other students respond to you because they see that you're different.
Mhm.
And so I want to create the sort of soft landing for him so that being different even isn't something that makes him feel singled out.
Mhm.
So I am wondering, just from a personal perspective, if you have any knowledge to impart to somebody like me going through this new struggle. I'm sure that we have listeners to this podcast who could also personally understand from your learnings of the last year and a half of recording episodes along these fronts.
Oh, wow. That's big. And
That's a big question. Yeah.
yeah. And one, I just want to say, I guess, you know, I'm happy that your your son has this diagnosis now, because as you said, there are tools to help him. And, he's young enough where you can come in and support. And I feel like one of the things I hear from a lot of my guests, and probably you've experienced as well with this new found knowledge that you're likely autistic as well, is that there are a lot of things that in childhood that if we had known, or if society had been in a different place, that probably would have helped us a lot. So now you're in a position to be able to support him and get him the tools and the support that he needs. So I think that's really a great thing. And yeah, so a very I guess some people might think it's odd, but I'm very happy for him that he's got this diagnosis so he can get the
The
support. And
support.
yeah, absolutely, and happy for you as well, to have this realization about him and about yourself as well. Um, Gosh, in terms, it's so hard for me to advise because I'm not a parent myself, so I really try not to give a lot of parenting advice because I really don't have any real perspective on what it's really like. I can only speak from my own experience and the experience of some of my guests that I've interviewed. One thing I would say that's come up in a couple of conversations about as I talk to adults who are looking back on their childhoods is that some of them got their autism diagnosis earlier in life, but their parents didn't know how to tell them, didn't want to tell them with like the best of intentions. And then they just found out in some way that wasn't really ideal later in their life. So I guess I would just say, definitely find whatever is an age appropriate way to share this information. I'll just speak out to parents who might be in this situation, because as you said, you knew that you were different back then, and other kids knew you were different. So likely your child is having some sort of similar experience. So it helps to be able to put a name. And I know it can be a scary thing sometimes when you first hear it, but it's important, and it's not, it doesn't necessarily put specific limits on what your child can do. It doesn't mean that they're gonna, it doesn't determine anything specifically. It just means that they need different types of supports to be able to become, successful adults, and that will look different for every individual. So that's one thing. I guess that's the one thing that popped out as much for me. And then yeah, to just continue to support your child. And I guess don't, it's hard to say. I guess don't try to make them into someone that they're not. So I know sometimes there's a lot of focus on behaving in certain ways. I'm sure I know I've kind of felt that pressure growing up. I'm sure a lot of people have, that are kind of counter to the way that you normally do. So, if your kid's not comfortable making a lot of eye contact, like don't force them to, like things like that are not really, that are kind of like weird social norms that we have, but are not really necessary to like health or communication. Like, they don't have to be, they don't have to act in a certain way. It's really a good balance of, the skills that they need to succeed in life versus their own comfort level, and being sensitive to whatever sensory issues that they may have, and understanding that it might look different from a neurotypical child.
Yeah. Well, I found myself reflecting on a moment in my life and wondering if other adults recognized that I had an issue similar to this, because throughout my earlier childhood, I had a very hard time at recess.
Mhm.
And I would find myself getting picked on, jokes played on me, all the April Fool's jokes were about me, like, or directed at me, things like that. And I ended up by the second grade volunteering in the special education setup and working with students that were blind, deaf, who had severe autism or another mental difference, right?
Mm.
And also individuals who had Down syndrome. And so it was a hodgepodge because I grew up in a small town. And when you have special education, often you're dealing with all sorts of different students and learning abilities and learning styles. And so I even had started to learn Braille and to learn sign language. And I found it to be incredibly rewarding and also felt like I belonged in this somewhat misfit mix of kids,
Mhm.
right? And I've reflected on this often over the years. I was like, well, why did I have such a hard time at recess? And it was really because of social connection and how I mean, you're all expected to go out there and play and have fun, but it was not fun for me. So I would prefer to stay behind in the classroom and um, work on a project or donate my time and do something different like what I was doing with a special education group. Now, there's all sorts of different terminology today for these things. And I'm still learning how that fits and what's, what the options will be for my child and if he'll need to have more of that type of learning setup where he's separated from the typical classroom or if he's going to be integrated continually. And so we'll just continue to give him what he needs, but it's opened my mind in a new way, just in reflection back to my own childhood and my own experience.
Mhm.
It's explaining a lot. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, looking back. Yeah, it once you get either diagnosed or once you self-identify as autistic, it's this whole, like, it'll probably last a long time, this whole long process of looking back and being like, "I wonder if that, if that's why I was doing that," or because everything that I'd done, I was attributing to something else. Like, at recess, like, I could play, like, structured games that weren't too athletic because I was very, like, uncoordinated, which is another thing that tends to go along with autism. Not everyone. So I was terrible at any kind of sports. So beyond sort of basic games. But yeah, I was always trying to like hang out with the adults and like I wound up as I got older doing specific projects in my free time. But then I'm like, well, maybe it's because I'm an only child. So of course I'm like always much more comfortable with adults. And of course I love being by myself all the time because like I better like it because I'm an only child and there's not a lot of people around 24/7 to entertain me or for me to entertain myself with. So, yeah, but looking back, I'm like, yeah, but I know other only children and they're not really necessarily like that. So maybe it wasn't always that way.
Yeah,
So
in my
yeah,
case,
we'll probably spend a lot of time reflecting
yeah.
back and sort of rethinking
That
how
same
I got up.
excuse I was making because, "Oh, it's because I only wear hand-me-down clothes and I'm a hippie kid, so I don't fit in with all of the lumbertown children here."
Mhm.
So yeah, it's you make excuses because you don't know, right?
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily have the tools.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting journey, and I'm honestly at this point just I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I'm excited to see what's next as opposed to feeling like, okay, well, what are we going to do? And what's the problem with Roland? And it's been almost like the problem with him.
Mm.
And now he's newly 5. He's not, like in kindergarten yet. He's in TK. This is, I think, a good time to figure it out and
Yeah.
to position for this next phase.
Mhm.
My next question relates to the podcast content that you've been recording over the course of the last year. And just really wanting to hear from you, what have the big surprises or aha moments been?
Oh gosh.
I'm sure there are
Um,
many because you cover so many subjects. And so I just, it's one of the things I love about podcasting. I feel like what is it? Neil deGrasse Tyson, he was on Smart List, which is another podcast I sometimes listen to. And he said, if you don't have a mind blown moment every week, you're
mhm.
not living right.
Mm.
And I think it's hard to consistently have a mind blown moment every week. And perhaps as a scientist, if you're just paid to just work with your mind constantly, that is a little bit easier. But it's something that I feel podcasting has helped me, and specifically having an interview format show when you're connecting with different people.
Mhm.
So if there's any moments of that remark that you want to share.
Oh gosh. I mean, I feel like there's it's a constant learning experience for me. I think I don't know if there are specific moments, but I think that every episode really starts to open my eyes and my mind to neurodiversity and disability and just the human condition in general. So one, I guess, is realizing just how many overlaps there are between, neurodivergent, you know, conditions. I don't know. I hate to say conditions, but sometimes I do. So a lot of times people who are autistic are also ADHD or also have Tourette's or also have dyspraxia. I guess I'm kind of rare. So, because as far as I know, I'm only autistic. I don't think I have other neurodivergencies about myself, but I don't know. What do I know? Like 2 years ago, I never would have said I was autistic. So, maybe I'll learn something more about myself. But a lot of people have multiple conditions, which makes it harder, of course, to really understand, especially if you're late diagnosed, what relates to what and how that manifests differently in different people. And I think too is just learning more about how everybody's there are a lot of things that people who are autistic or have ADHD, dyslexia have in common, but it's not like there's one type of person and that everybody's the same. So when people talk about, for example, autism being a spectrum, I think what pops into a lot of people's minds at first, it's like, oh, that's a spectrum from like severe to like high functioning, which the labels that the autistic community really hates because they tend to be put on by people who are outside looking in and observing your behavior and don't
Mhm.
necessarily cover what it feels like, like
Yeah.
I
I
might
mean,
be
I
being
even
really,
said on
yeah,
the spectrum in this specific interview, and I
yeah.
already know that that gives me the creeps, but I still
I
said it.
know. It's a tough one, but on this what the spectrum really is more like is that they have, we have, some people may have, um, I like to use it like empathy, like, some people who are autistic may not have empathy or express it in the same way that neurotypical people do, but others may have like extremely strong empathy, like the whole concept of like highly sensitive person, which a lot of people kind of think like, well, that's just sort of like autistic girl, autistic woman talk, but like described in a different way. Cause that's how I took the HSP test. And I'm like, oh, yes, this is 100% me. Absolutely, because autistic isn't that associated with low empathy? It's not. I mean, certainly some people may have low empathy, but other autistic people, I think maybe most of them have extremely high empathy, where we like might be personifying our stuffed animals and giving, and being sad if they're sad. It really could go. So that's what the spectrum is a lot of those types of traits or abilities. And yeah, so it's a lot to really look into. And that's why I think a lot of autistic people are just seem like we're very different from each other. But we all have the same types of things in common with the types of things we struggle with. We may just struggle in different ways. Like some of us may be very, quiet, which is I tend to be very quiet and not really knowing how to like be part of a conversation. But others may be like super talkative, and that in itself could be an issue because you're like not, you know, that doesn't fit into social norms either for whatever way. It's just,
Yeah.
but it manifests.
Oversharing and,
Yeah, oversharing. Yeah,
getting deep into a particular topic that the person listening to is not listening anymore. You've seen their
exactly.
eyes glaze over, but you
Yeah,
don't recognize it, so you just keep doing the mind dump.
yeah.
Guilty as charged. So, and it's interesting right now. I think you have light coming in from the side. There's
I
almost a
do. The light's
spectrum.
coming in.
So,
Yeah.
this is something that when I do communicate, if people are talking about being on the spectrum, if you look at it like a rainbow,
Mhm.
then I think it's just more of a particular kind way to see it, because you have different colors and you have different kind of representations, and it doesn't mean that it's high versus low functioning. And what does that even mean? We've
Mhm.
walked away from terms like Asperger's.
Mhm.
I learned yesterday, talking to a friend who's a psychologist, that that people who have autism are more likely to also have gender nonconformity,
Yes.
which I then reflected on my teen years where I started dressing as a boy for a while. And I was really not sure where I was and if it was a sexuality preference or just a uncomfortability in my own skin, just related to, going through hormones and being a teenager, which can be an incredibly uncomfortable time for a lot of people.
Mhm.
But that was before it was, as commonplace it is today. I'm 46 years old, so we're talking early 90s here,
Mhm.
late 80s, early 90s. That's when I was, going through a lot of this questioning. Ultimately, I'm comfortable in my skin today, and it has taken me time to get there. But there's also this assumption when you have somebody who is able to get up on a stage and present or is able to be a part of a board meeting. Like I've got an MBA now and I've struggled through all the academics and now I think I've learned how to learn math, which took me an incredibly long time and which also meant that I didn't pursue hard sciences in my undergrad. I went for archaeology, which was like a pretty hard science of the soft sciences because that's where my interests were, but I couldn't get past statistics. I couldn't get past algebra 2 trigonometry.
Mhm.
And now as a 45-year-old adult, when I'm now 46, but at the time I was, just turning 45, I graduated with my MBA, top of my class, honors and everything else,
Mhm.
beta, gamma, sigma, all that jazz. And I'm just like, how did I do it? I struggled. I
Mhm.
sat there and beat my head against a brick wall, having to relearn statistics. I had to employ a tutor for a while to help me understand the rudimentary calculus because one of the courses I took was essentially calculus and assumed that you knew the fundamentals.
Mhm.
I also figured out through this that with greater than, less than, I was
Mhm.
flipping them all the time. And the only
Mm.
way that I could ascertain that was by having a tutor with me as I was doing some of the work and they helped me identify it. So I was like, okay, so this is yeah, da, da, da. And he's like, no. You said less than, but you wrote greater than.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh, I did. And now it flips the entire meaning of the equation you're working on. And of course, you're not going to get the right answer. Right. And
Right.
so I had to go through this kind of retraining of even how I did my coursework when I was doing homework, and then bring that into how I did my test taking, which of course is a solo enterprise. Right.
Mhm.
And learning that I needed to both say it, look at it, say it again to myself.
Mhm.
Right, in order to verify that it was going the right direction. Now, if you think back to algebra and trigonometry and all of this, what are you using? You're using a lot of these signs, representations. And if my brain was always flipping it,
Mm.
it's its own kind of special, like kind of math dyslexia. And I don't know how else to put it. I've not gone through an additional diagnosis, but I had to struggle through that. And so if you see students in high school, college struggling with some of these same things, you know, if you put a layer of anxiety on top of it and you say, okay, you're taking your SAT now, right? And
Mhm.
this is going to determine your path in life, what college you're able to get into.
Mhm.
This is sort of a standardized test. I couldn't finish the math section. So my
Ah.
score was terrible.
Mhm.
Like I know that the scoring is different today, but I was like in the bottom third on math
Wow.
because I couldn't get through that section. And so even the way that we've architected scholastics, entry into college, things like that is not set for all people. And
Right.
so I wonder if you have heard similar stories and if there's even, I mean, do you know about accommodations that can be made for people that might deal with some of these same struggles so that they can go into Ivy League schools and have the same opportunities?
That's good. Because you were just telling that story about, you know, flipping signs and it reminded me of another guest who is, I think she's dyslexic. She's multiply neurodivergent, but one of them is dyslexic, and she talks about, like, she thinks she writes down one thing, and then the teacher's like, "You got this wrong." She's like, "I wrote 60." He's like, "No, you wrote 6." She's like, "No, I didn't write 6." And then, yeah, she wrote 6. So that concept of, like, that challenge of, and I'm sure it's the same for math as well with, I think dyscalculia is like the math version of dyslexia, to simplify it way too much. But yeah, so that is something that I've heard from guests who have struggled with that before they kind of really understood, or at the beginning of understanding their own neurodivergence. And accommodations, um, I think it potentially relates to the person. So I'm thinking of one interview that I did last year with a young autistic author. He's a college student now. I think he's really interested in biology. He's doing some sort of like biology degree in college, but he struggled in especially middle school because he but not necessarily academically, but behaviorally, because it was before he was diagnosed as autistic, and he literally like couldn't control his body movement. Like he couldn't sit still. He had a hard time focusing in a classroom setting, and he was always getting called out for like behavior problems and getting disciplined for it. And after a lot of advocating by his parents, they tried to get him into a different school, and they wouldn't accommodate him. So what wound up is for high school, he wound up doing going to like a community college. I think one of his parents was like an instructor there, so it somehow worked out that he was able to go. And that setting works so much better for him, because he's like, nobody cares if I'm like pacing back and forth in the back of the classroom, as long as I'm still paying attention. That's how I need to pay attention. I need that movement. And so he did well enough to like get his high school diploma, or equivalent, from finishing high school through community college classes, which are, I'm assuming more challenging academically than high school. But in that way, that type of accommodation really seemed to work for him, because nobody cared that he was not sitting there like a good, perfect little student with like your eye contact and you're taking your notes and you're quiet all the time. But it's still, without distracting other people in the class, he was still able to learn, and that situation worked much better for him. So I think, yeah, accommodations, again, I haven't been part of the school system since I went through it, and we're basically the same age, so it was like, oh, I have no idea how they do things these days. But I would say, I would just say sort of really trying to tune in and listen to your child. And because a lot of these things come out as behavior issues, and that's the first thing like people jump to if they're not really thinking about, is like, oh, he's misbehaving, we have to like take away his iPad or punish him or ground him or something to stop this behavior. But go deeper and just say, like, why are what's causing this behavior? Are there triggers? Are there things happening beforehand? Is it really loud in this room? Are there fluorescent lights? Is there like weird smells? Check all the sensory stuff, because they could be reacting to some sensory input that you may not think is distracting, but for them is overwhelming, because that's very common with a lot of autistic people. And if you can kind of remove some of those distractions, or, some people need to move around more. Some people can listen without making eye contact. In fact, forcing someone to make eye contact is so distracting for them that they won't even hear you. So I think it's understanding those things about your child, and then seeing what kind of accommodations work best for them. And it may not even have to be like huge things. It all depends on the individual.
Yeah. Well, I was smiling a bit there because, I went to college for my senior year of high school and got high school credit for it.
Mhm.
And I found that learning experience to be much more constructive for me.
Mhm.
And there were a few reasons. One is that I went from the semester system to the quarter system.
Mhm.
So things just moved a little bit more quickly, and therefore I was able to remain more engaged.
Mhm.
And it helped me to just only have to be in a class for 13 weeks, or less than that. I think it was like 10 weeks, right?
Mhm.
From start to finish. And I think because if I could suffer through anything for 10 weeks, if I could
Yeah.
put that, right? But then when you
Mhm.
have half the year and you have to come back to it after a break, and then there's more work to do, I found that to be really a challenge to like get
Yeah.
back into the same class, but you're in the middle of it. And
Yeah.
this is like one of the things that I think, we've noticed in our younger son. Change is really hard for him, right?
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so if you think about that, like it was easier for me to open a new page after a break,
Mhm.
right? and be, here's a fresh book and it's a fresh class. And so even just acknowledging that that's the way I learn, and it's like you close a chapter, you open a new one, right?
Mhm.
And that is, it just made more sense for me.
Yeah.
And so I think we'll go through much of that. But the other piece is that, we also know that my older son is, he's exhibiting certain signs of math dyslexia. I'm forgetting the term that you said. It was
I always pronounce it wrong. I'll say it's dyscalculia.
yeah,
Dyscalculia, one of those.
dyscalculia or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyways, so he will say 12 and write down 2 1,
Yeah.
right? Because in his mind, the tw that he's starting with is a 2, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so there's like these speech and math connections that he's just having a hard time with. And I
Mhm.
see it consistently, like 60 and 16, he will often transpose,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so there's just a lot of these that have common pronunciations. And so it's a language to math tie. And so we're working on it and getting through it. And then he just can't sit still. So they have him in the classroom. An accommodation for him is that he sits on a stool, because in a chair, he does this. He slumps.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because he will start to fall out of it, which I'm sure anybody watching this on YouTube, that was just the most attractive pose you'll ever see of me. As I slumped out of my chair. Um, so they made the accommodation. They have a stool, and they will allow him to pace a little bit around his desk. And so the fact that we're getting to a space in our education system where we'll allow these things, because we acknowledge that people learn differently as early as elementary school, to me is incredibly encouraging, and
Mhm.
says that we're moving in a direction of truly accepting neurodivergence, not as a disability, but as a different ability and
Mhm.
a different style of learning. And so I'm encouraged. I personally think that this is going to allow us to enter a phase of incredible, um, I'd say an explosion of creativity.
Mm.
Because if you enable people to learn the way they learn, and you give them the tools that they need, as opposed to saying square peg, round hole, you don't fit, bang, 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 just push through, then my belief is that we're going to enter a new era that is ushered in by this greater acceptance of people for all the colors of the spectrum that they might be.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it's right. There are different, their education system tends to sort of enforce one way to learn and one way to measure learning. Like you were talking about standardized tests before, and how that really is not, those are not optimal for not just neurodivergent kids, but like many other kids. Um, but yeah, I think it would be great if we can actually value and support the different ways that people learn, because it's not, there's no like one right way to learn things,
Right.
or to work or express yourself. We really have people who, have different types of talents and just express it in different ways. So yeah, absolutely. I really hope that that we're getting to that point.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Carolyn, so much for joining me today. And I want to offer you the floor for a moment to talk about your podcast and the beautiful things that are coming down the road. I'm sure there will be many more awards that come your way, from Positive Change Podcast Awards, because you are doing so much there, the W3 Awards, and also the Signal Awards. I've yet to capture any of those, so I'm a little jealous.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on the show, and especially such a big show like this with big news for you. And again, congratulations. And I'm, my show again is called Beyond 6 Seconds. It goes beyond those 6 second first impressions to really get more time to understand and explore the extraordinary stories of neurodivergent people from all walks of life. And I've interviewed guests who, are autistic, have ADHD, Tourette's, dyspraxia, dyslexia, auditory processing disorder, Down syndrome, and a whole, host of just neurodiversities that I'm starting to and I'm starting to learn more and more about. So it's really a great way to listen in and hear individual experiences of what it's like being an adult who's neurodivergent, and just getting an idea of looking back on childhood, what that was like, and just what are they doing now? What are they into? Whether it's a, cool passion projects, great advocacy, professions that they're in. So I felt like it's a really interesting way to hear from people, as you said at the beginning of the show, that, we hear a lot about, we get talked about a lot, especially with like autistic children, and then we all grow up and seem to disappear. So I'm trying to find everybody who seems to have disappeared, and put them on the show and really share like what life is like, and what their challenges still are, what amazing successes they've been able to find, what they've learned about themselves, and all the great work that they're doing in the world. So yeah, definitely tune in. You can find Beyond 6 Seconds on pretty much any podcast app or podcast player. I'm also at beyond6seconds.net. I've got all my episodes there, and you can check it out and find me on social media. I'm kind of all over the place. So yeah, I hope you'll check it out.
Well, thank you so much again. And I will share with my community here. It is always a great pleasure to receive a written review about your podcast. So if you enjoy this one, Care More, Be Better, and also Beyond 6 Seconds, please write a review. Reach out. We love hearing from you, and it helps to inform future content. You might say, hey, what about this specific neurodivergence? Or in the case of Care More, Be Better, you might send me a note about specific issues that you want to see more of on the social impact side, or measures with regard to climate action, things along these lines. I do want to hear from you too. And I want to say before we part too, Carolyn, that I met an individual that I think you should have on your show if you haven't featured her yet. Her name is Brittany of Brittany's Baskets. Are you familiar?
No.
Okay. So this individual, she is she has Down syndrome, and she sends a basket to parents of newborn Down syndrome babies every time that they're born as a celebration. And so much like you said, congratulations on the diagnosis, because at least now she's really just working to disarm and celebrate new life. And the fact that different isn't bad. I mean, so we need to embrace one another and give those babies all the love that they deserve. So
Awesome.
really, really interesting individual. I spoke with her and her mother in anticipation of bringing them on the show. It was a little challenging because their audio equipment at the time was just not really working for me. And so I think at this phase, you probably are more used to running a little bit of check on those things, and building in accommodations that will work for that. I haven't dove deeply into that piece yet.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I would love to connect with them.
I'll make the introduction.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, listen, I have so appreciated this time with you. I love your podcast, and I'm going to keep listening. So, yeah, you helped me on my journey already. You've helped me since the very beginning. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
As I'm sure you can see from this episode, I'm really looking to explore deeply the topics that we cover here. And in this case, these ones touch my heart. They touch my home life. They touch my family life. And the reality is, as an adult who now identifies as being somewhat autistic, and wherever I fit with that, I'm still exploring. I may go through the official diagnosis. And if I do, I plan to share it on this show and to help other people understand that they are not alone. Ultimately, that is what podcasting has done for me over the course of the last couple of years, because I'm not alone in caring about these social issues and caring about our climate and wanting to dive deeply into these subjects. And I hear from all of you, from our community, consistently that, heck, you're grateful for that too. I will continue to post Be Better challenges each Monday. And so for this week, the anniversary of the show, the hashtag Be Better challenge is likely to focus on autism. So with that, I want to say thank you all for joining me today. I wouldn't do it without you. I do it for you and with you. I am so grateful for all of you for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can care more. We can be better. We can even make an ideal world for all of the beautiful brains out there. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.